Now, Tom, you are the founder of ZodiacKiller.com, which is the only Zodiac Killer website recognized by law enforcement. So, in other words, you are an unofficial expert on the case. For someone who has never heard of the Zodiac before, how would you describe the crimes and the killer's modus operandi?
Well, I can't believe there's anybody left who hasn't heard about the Zodiac Killer in this day and age. But just in case I find that one person, I would tell them that the Zodiac was kind of a comic book villain come to life who seemed to be, now he's like out of a Batman movie or something, like the Joker or the Riddler, who committed murders. And then instead of just getting away with the crimes, he created challenges for himself, like taunting the police and forcing the newspapers to publish his letters with clues to his identity that he claimed that he was giving us.
What would you say about his modus operandi? Who did he target, and were there reasons behind why he targeted those people?
Well, the list of possible victims is so large that if you just focus on the confirmed victims, the only consistency really is that he changed each time something somehow. I mean, he targeted victims that were younger couples in secluded settings at night for the first two, but there were changes that he made in between those first two attacks. And then the third attack it was still a young couple in a secluded setting, but it was much different than the previous two. It was not at night. It was during the day, and it was actually a pretty well-populated recreation spot. And he did other things along the way, such as calling the police and taunting them and writing messages on the victim's car door. In the first attack, he, for some reason, allowed one of the victims to try to run away before he shot her. Mm-hmm. And then in the follow-up attack, he made sure to keep both victims in the car while he was shooting them. He made subtle changes along the way. And then his last confirmed attack, it was a male cab driver in the heart of San Francisco. So he changed, kind of like The Thing, that Kurt Russell movie where you never know where he's going to turn up and what kind of shape he's going to be in. So it was definitely very disconcerting for people in the San Francisco Bay Area back then because they didn't know where they would be safe or what kind of person he would target next.
And at the time of this killer's rampage, your father was a reporter for a local newspaper. How old were you back then, and what do you remember about that period of time?
Yeah, my father was a newspaper man, and a lot of people today don't really know what that is because newspapers aren't a thing anymore, but they used to be kind of like the internet. That's how people used to get their information, and my father was a newspaper reporter in Los Angeles for a newspaper called the Herald Examiner. Yeah, we lived in Santa Monica. I was very young, and it was a pretty idyllic setting until the Manson family. They kind of ruined my childhood, so I didn't get the Brady Bunch. I got the Manson family when I was growing up, and I don't know what was scarier when before they caught him and they were on the loose. That was scary, but after they caught him, and I got to see what he looked like and those eyes, it was just terrifying. So, needless to say, that my parents decided that maybe Oregon would be a better place to raise a family. But then we moved to Oregon, and crazy stuff started happening up here too, like Bigfoot, D.B. Cooper, Mount St. Helens. So I just kind of accepted the fact that I'm going to be living around weird stuff for the rest of my life.
And there are a lot of serial killers at that time around those areas, as you mentioned. Your site itself has been online since 1998. I'm interested in what originally struck you about the Zodiac over other cases, and what has kept you motivated to continue to invest so much of your time into this case.
Rumor has it that Zodiac won't be solved, but I'm attracted to it because the Zodiac case is definitely solvable. And that's why I started a website. I felt like all we have to do is put all the information in one spot. People around the world can access it over the internet, and somebody will spot a clue that evaded everyone else, and that will hopefully lead to the identity of the Zodiac. I don't really think that'll happen anymore. According to law enforcement, they need DNA before they can advance the case. So the days of someone being identified through old-fashioned detective work, those days were over for Zodiac a long time ago. As far as why I started the site, definitely revenge. I grew up with a really screwed up childhood because of the craziness that was going on around us. When the Mansons were on the loose, we were living very close by, and my mother used to go to bed with a knife under her pillow. She was terrified, and that's tough for a little kid to see when your mom's scared. Then that's a big deal. And I can't really do anything about the Mansons. They got caught and dying in jail, each one of them. But if I can help catch the Zodiac one day, then that will be good revenge for everything I grew up with. There were a lot of serial killers, and I used to say that North America is tilted to the left and all the nuts rolled to the West Coast at some point in the 60s. And my dad and we used to go to the Portland airport just for recreation, just for fun. Back before 9/11, airports were fun to visit.
Yeah.
And we were at the airport, I think it was the day before D.B. Cooper took off from Portland to Seattle and hijacked a plane. So it just seems like growing up, everywhere I turned, something weird happened.
Have you ever reflected on why in that region of the world, and specifically in California, that there have been so many cases of serial killers?
Well, the ones, like Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer and Robert Yates, and the ones that were primarily in the Seattle area, you could point to the climate. The weather, a lot of people have said, well, it's so cloudy and rainy, it would drive anybody crazy. I think it's more along the lines of that in the late 60s, a lot of people were dropping out. They were leaving their past lives. They were flocking to the West Coast. It attracted a lot of people because during that time, there was a great deal of unrest in California, and the rioting in East LA and the university protests where the students were in uprisings, and especially in the Bay Area, the violent confrontations with police and the arson attacks and the fighting and this all made the world news. And the fact that a lot of people recognized that San Francisco was kind of a place for drugs, mayhem, free sex, all that stuff, I think it attracted a lot of people that were like-minded from all over the country. And a lot of those people just migrated to the Bay Area and joined in. And so there are so many missing people in California, so many dead people, so many murder victims. It was a recipe for disaster. And I would guesstimate that there are probably in the thousands of homicide victims in California who have relatives that they don't even know that they're dead. They don't know that they've been killed because they were basically living a transient lifestyle.
I spoke to a retired NCIS Detective Joe Kennedy, and he put the number of cold case homicides in the United States of America at around 280,000 unsolved cold cases. I wanted to take it back to your website for a moment. What I think is really notable about how you approach this case is it's very evident that you're after the facts, not about inserting your opinion into what you think happened. It's a platform where people from around the world can come together and compile information about the Zodiac. So I'm sure over the years you've had a lot of people writing into you with information on the case or what they think is information on the case. Are there recurring themes in the information that people are providing to you?
Oh, sure. My dad was the Zodiac. That's the most popular reoccurring theme.
Father issues.
Yeah, daddy issues. And then one of the claims went kind of viral where somebody got some news attention on TV. And so that turned it into kind of a fad where everybody thinks their dad was the Zodiac because he had dark rimmed glasses. And that's all you need to know is your dad had dark rimmed glasses. And so you email Tom and you turn him in and say, hey, I think he was the Zodiac. So that's happened quite a bit. And
most people basing it on that, I would guess you were then, Tom.
I know. I tell people, look, I look like the wanted poster. I got the short, military crew cut, dark rim glasses, and I can make that same grimace that Zodiac has in the wanted poster. So I can imagine being a cop back then, all the tips that they must have gotten that were just a waste of time. All you have to do is open a yearbook, a high school yearbook from the late 1960s, and half the guys in the yearbook are going to be wearing dark rim glasses and half are going to have crew cuts. But most people are well-meaning. Some people really want their dad to be the Zodiac, and that kind of is gross.
What about in terms of examples of you receiving credible and important information? Has that happened?
Oh, sure. I've starting in 1998, actually starting before I launched the website, I started doing Zodiac research on the internet in, I think it was 1995. I had read a book and I tried to look up some names from that book to get more info. I didn't know how to use the internet yet, so I just used the phone. And I called people. I got numbers from directory assistants, and then ended up contacting Paul Avery, who was the reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who wrote a majority of the Zodiac stories. And I got him on the phone. The first time he hung up on me, cursed me out and hung up on me. And then I waited about a week and I called him back because I thought, if I don't call him back, I lose. And he was so apologetic, and he had some health problems and was having a bad day. And so he was glad I called him back. He ended up giving me a whole bunch of insider information, including the real names of some of the Zodiac suspects that up until that point had only been known under nicknames or aliases to the public. And that was just an absolute game changer, because all of a sudden I had information that nobody else had. I took that to the internet and was shocked when I was shown how to do a search for Zodiac killer, and like 3 websites turned up, and that was it. And 2 of them just had like a news report. There was really nothing on the case. And what the site I did find had a guest book. If you remember what those are back then, you go to a website and you could leave a comment. So I left a comment in the guest book at one of these sort of Zodiac websites that had like one page that kind of gave an overview of the Zodiac case. And someone saw that comment and was astounded that I knew the real name of one of the suspects, because it had never been publicized. And it turned out that he was the son of that suspect's best friend. And so we started emailing each other, and I ended up getting a page of the suspect's handwriting from this guy. And so I had his real name. And this is Arthur Lee Allen, by the way. And so I had Arthur Lee Allen's real name. I had a page of his handwriting. And from there, I found an ex-FBI agent who took my information and within a half an hour gave me Allen's mugshot. So I could see what he looked like, the top suspect. I could see his handwriting, and I had his real name. And so when I finally launched my own website, I had stuff that people had wondered about for decades and had never seen. And so within 6 months, I was on television and the Howard Stern show and places like that. So it kind of worked, everything is unfolded like I kind of assumed it would. Up until now, I've always assumed we'll figure out who the Zodiac was, and I'm still confident about that. But I've been putting forth, I guess you asked, that revealing new information and coming up with new information, including from the police. My best sources have been law enforcement. And I'm the only civilian that has been allowed into the evidence rooms. That's where I got the police reports and the crime scene photos and all that stuff. So it's continuing to this day. And whenever there's a new development, I get alerted from law enforcement, and I get to kind of be the big reveal. I've had people say, well, when are they going to put together a press conference about a Zodiac update or something? And I'm like, I'm the press conference. And I have been for 20 some years. But there's a lot of people that don't know the history of it and never went to my website because I was a little slow getting mobile friendly. I didn't get a mobile friendly version of my site until a couple years ago. So there's a huge generation gap.
We were talking about Arthur Lee Allen there because your site was, in fact, the first place to publish the mugshot of Arthur Lee Allen.
Yeah.
And who do you believe the main suspect to be, and why?
My best candidate, if I was going to hire the Zodiac killer and I was taking applications, I would probably immediately interview Richard Gaikowski. I would go with Gaikowski simply because, unlike Arthur Lee Allen, Gaikowski was never turned upside down and shaken. And I wish he had been, but he unfortunately was not. Allen was the recipient of those search warrants. They took his handwriting, they took his fingerprints, they took his DNA, and nothing of substance has ever matched the Zodiac. Maybe one day something will be uncovered from Richard Gaikowski where they can get his DNA from something and test it. But then again, that's problematic because there is no Zodiac DNA sample that investigators are satisfied with.
So what does that say about the partial DNA sample from the stamp on the letter. What's that about?
Well, that was about a TV show trying to fool people into thinking that they had some kind of exclusive news. It was 2002, and it was a network television show. And the premise of the show was to try to get DNA from Zodiac evidence and then compare it to DNA from some of the top suspects. And what the show didn't tell you is that the DNA that was recovered from the Zodiac evidence was DNA that was found on a stamp. Normally that would be great because it would be from the back of the stamp where the Zodiac would have licked, but they didn't tell you that the DNA was actually from the top or the front of the stamp. And that could have been DNA that was left by the sweaty mailman who was carrying the letter. No person has ever been matched to that DNA, but there's probably, it could be Zodiac's DNA. I mean, if you think about from the time Zodiac would have dropped that letter in the mailbox until the time it was recognized as being evidence, 10 or 15 different people could have handled it. So I'd say there's a 1 in 15 chance it was Zodiac's DNA, but definitely it was not the Grand Slam home run that the TV show presented that, oh, this doesn't match the top suspects. Well, in my opinion, it's probably not Zodiac's DNA.
With that sample, whether it is or not the DNA of the Zodiac, we saw Joseph DeAngelo get found and convicted through genetic genealogy. Do you have any hope or aspiration that genetic genealogy could be used in this case?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's being done right now in increments. The most recent result was late last year, and this is one of the most recent things that I got to kind of reveal to the world, is that there was a profile that was uncovered from Zodiac evidence, but unfortunately it was from an individual who could not have been the Zodiac. So it's one step forward, 2 steps back, and that's kind of been the progress over the last 20 years since it's been about 23 years since investigators have tried to use DNA to advance the case. And it's sort of working, but I don't have too much confidence that Zodiac's true DNA profile will ever be 100% obtained, but I have hope, I guess. But finding DNA on the evidence is not going to close the case. It's just going to start probably a very long, frustrating investigation, which has sort of already started.
That's really interesting, Tom. It's news to me. Another thing I wanted to ask you about is the hot topic for debate in this case is whether police officers Donald Fauci and Eric Zelms stopped and talked to the Zodiac killer the night Paul Stein was murdered. Your thoughts?
It would not surprise me. Eric Zelms was killed in the line of duty later that same year, so there's no way to pursue that lead. But as far as Donald Fauci, he died recently in the last couple of years. I had a long email exchange with him over a number of years. He always denied it. He denied it from the beginning. He denied ever having stopped and talked to anybody. Now, this is right after the cab driver, Paul Stein, was murdered, and Fauci and Zelms were responding in their patrol car, and they were informed to look for a black male adult because it was a mistaken dispatch. Fauci has admitted that they did see a white male adult, but since they were looking for a black man, and since they thought they could intercept him before he entered the military installation, they kept going. They didn't stop and talk to anybody. And that makes sense. Why would you stop and talk to someone that, when you think you can cut off the right guy, why would you stop and talk to somebody else? But it wouldn't surprise me if a conversation did happen and Fauci just, for whatever reason, could not own up to it. Maybe embarrassment, or maybe he was told to always deny it. We'll never know, because even if Zodiac is caught and he says, oh yeah, I stopped and talked to Officer Fauci, you can't believe a thing the guy says. So it's one of those deals. A lot of people spend their time trying to figure out stuff that you can't ever know. You're never going to know if that conversation took place. So I don't even waste any time on it. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Either way.
And does it push the investigation forward at the end of the day?
No, it's a big time suck. It's a time suck. There's a lot of time sucks that people get, especially people that are just now learning about the Zodiac case. They get caught up in these time sucks. And the time, trust me, you're going to wake up one day and you're going to be like, man, I've spent 6 months wasting my time trying to figure out something that I can never know the answer to for sure.
Exactly. Another person that you have spoken to over the years is William Crowe. Just to give a little bit of context, William Crowe is a witness who reported seeing a suspicious vehicle in the area where David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were murdered. But according to you, Tom, over the years, he changed his story significantly.
Yes.
What can you tell me about that?
I don't know why people do that. So Crow was with his girlfriend, and they were out on Lake Herman Road, and they were at a turnout. They were, I guess, they were going to go look at Christmas lights or something, but he had a sports car, and he pulled over and was, I guess he was tuning it or something, messing with the engine, and a suspicious car pulled up and freaked him out. And so they left the area, and they felt like the car might have followed him for a little while. And so anyway, later that night, Zodiac's first double murder happened in the same spot. So Crow came forward to the sheriff's department, told his story. And so at the time I interviewed Crow, I had not read the sheriff's report. I interviewed him in 2002, and he contacted me and said, oh yeah, I was there that night. And he told me that all he could see as far as the occupants of the suspicious car was that they were Caucasian male. That's all he could see. Well, when I finally got the sheriff's report, it matched up with what he told the sheriff shortly after the double murders, is that the occupants of the car were Caucasian males, but he couldn't see facial details or anything like that. So fast forward several years after I interviewed him, he got interviewed by a couple other Zodiac researchers, and by that point, he was, I guess I didn't give him enough attention, so he went to other researchers and was telling people, oh, the guy looked just like the Zodiac. He had the crew cut, he had the dark rim glasses. And I'm thinking, wow, so you didn't tell the sheriff's department that in 1968. You didn't tell me that in 2002. And now here it is 5 years later, and all of a sudden you remember that the guy looked just like the Zodiac killer. So I don't know why people change stories like that. I even followed up in the interview. I said, could you see, could you see his hair? Could you see if he was facial hair or glasses or anything? No, I couldn't see any of that. Well, memories are funny, aren't they?
Well, that's what I was going to bring up, because it brings memory into question. I mean, it's well documented that our mind plays tricks on us, and it's not the most reliable source.
I mean, yeah, because everyone in the world knew that there was a Zodiac movie being made, and it coincided with all of a sudden his memory getting better. And all of a sudden he went from having a suspicious encounter, which I think he was out there, and I think somebody wanted to drag race, because that's Lake Herman Road, and that was the time, back in the late 60s, drag racing was a thing. He had a sports car. I think somebody just pulled up and wanted him to drag race, and he just got freaked out. But I think the timing's interesting, that right when this movie is in production, all of a sudden his account changes to make it almost appear as if he had to be a potential Zodiac victim. But yeah, I go with the closest account. So in other words, if you have a chance to talk to somebody who gave a statement right after their encounter, and go with that statement versus what they just told you 10 minutes ago after 50 years have passed, they're not going to remember. I've had a lot of experience with people involved in the Zodiac case, and they get, I call them replaced memories, where I'll interview somebody and they would tell me a different account than what was in the police report. And I would say, well, that's interesting, because that's not what you told the police. And they would say, well, I knew that you were going to come down and interview me, so I brushed up on the case by reading such and such book or reading such and such newspaper articles. And I'm thinking, oh boy, because people think that what they're reading is going to be 100% accurate. Oh, they couldn't publish that book unless it had been fact-checked, or else somebody could get sued. So you're reading books or watching documentaries that are probably 90% inaccurate. And I've had actual witnesses and case participants, original players, who, because 3 decades had passed and they hadn't really thought about the Zodiac case in all that time, it's not their hobby, it's not their interest, it's just something that happened briefly a long time ago. But they don't want to sound dumb in the interview, so they think they're brushing up on it and getting good information and remembering good information, and actually they're just being misled. And
they're
so
passing on misinformation in the end.
Exactly,
right?
and so and I've actually had people say, well, go with what I told the police originally, because that's going to be the truth, and that's going to be when I had my freshest memory. So that's what I always try to do. I don't go by some recent interview with a surviving victim recounting what happened 45 years ago.
What are some things that frustrate you about how other publications have reported on these crimes?
I've always felt like having a website is a big responsibility because I have millions of people who probably the busiest month I think was March 2007, and I had something like 35 million people at my website, and it was the month the David Fincher movie was released, and so they had something like a $35 million advertising budget, which was a lot back then. I had so much traffic that month that the website kind of like broke, and it couldn't keep documenting the traffic. It's a huge responsibility. So is self-publishing a book. Putting out any information that potentially can be read or heard or seen by lots of people is a big responsibility. And today it's just treated like something silly, And I see so many people putting out content, whether it's a website or a Facebook page or Reddit or Instagram or TikTok or YouTube. The people are they're in such a rush to be first in the comments or to get a like or a thumbs up or karma, none of which exists in reality. You don't get anything in reality from any of that stuff, but people are stepping over, doing a good job of fact-checking and putting out good, accurate content because they want to get downloads or they want to sell a book on Amazon or they want to hurry up and get a thumbs up. So the content is such garbage today as opposed to when I was starting out, there wasn't very much Zodiac content on the internet, but the people that you found, that you'd run across who were interested in the case, they were very much more knowledgeable than I'm finding people today.
It's great to hear you talk about your social responsibility, especially when you're running the risk of misinforming and what that can cause for victims, families, for example.
Yeah, it's always been important to me that the families of the victims have always been supportive of ZodiacKiller.com from the beginning, even before I launched the website. My best sources were, Pam Huckabee, who was Darlene Ferrin's sister, and she was actually living in Oregon where I was at the time. So I had spent a lot of time with her even before I started the website. I had really good sources, the retired detectives and people like that, and even some surviving victims. So that's always been important. It's rare when I have tried to reach out to somebody and they haven't really been interested. It's only happened on a few occasions, and that's fine. I didn't expect to be able to reach everybody, but I've reached all the people that were really important to get to, and a lot of them, luckily, I was able to reach them before they passed away. It's amazing how many people have passed on in the last 10 years or so. It used to be, probably it peaked in 2010 or so, but it used to be when a TV show would be interested in putting together a documentary about Zodiac, they'd contact me and I could put them in touch with so many key players that were original players back in the day. And now I can't find any. I mean, they're all gone. So the timing was right to get all this stuff kind of in an updated internet form. But at the same time, I know that I'm reaching people that were directly involved, and it's always been important to me to put out good information.
You're the author of The Zodiac Killer, Just the Facts. What can readers find in your book that's not on your website?
Well, I intentionally titled it Zodiac Killer, Just the Facts as kind of an inside joke because everybody already thinks they know the facts because they saw the Fincher movie or they listened to some Zodiac podcast by someone they don't even remember who it was, or they read a wonky self-published book on Amazon. So everyone already thinks they know the facts, and they don't. There's so much misinformation out there that it's almost exhausting to try to tackle it all. I do a little bit each day, but I'm still playing catch up. And the book is not for people who think they know everything. The book is for people who don't know anything or who recognize that they simply can't learn the foundation from a quick public service announcement or 30-second commercial or whatever. This is a now almost 54-year-old case. And the most important material is going to be the actual police documentation. Those are 8.5-inch by 10-inch reports. And that's official documentation. If there's ever a court proceeding, it will be introduced as evidence. So there is simply no way to make a document that size user-friendly on a small phone. And my book is simply the And it's already available on the internet, but most people don't really look at it anymore because it's just not user-friendly to read these reports. So they're in book form. And it's all of the police work. It's case by case, all of the available police reports. So it is just the facts. And it's not all the police reports. I was only able to get some. Okay, so when people say, oh, that's not in the police report, I always say, how do you know? You haven't seen the whole thing. We have a small percentage available to us, and we're lucky to have that. The police aren't obligated to give us this material. I was lucky to get it in 1998. And in the time since then, that I think the last time was in 2017, when I got to go in and videotape and so forth and look at other boxes of evidence, including reports. I reached into one box and it was a big handful of vintage police reports that I had never seen before. And that's a small sampling of 99% we don't have access to. But if you want to do serious research, either get on an old style monitor or read Zodiac Killer Just the Facts, because either way, you'll be able to see the police reports as they were meant to be read. You'll be able to see all the details of the crime scene photos. So many people today haven't even read the Zodiac letters because they're just not user-friendly on a small phone. But Sherlock Holmes used to carry around a magnifying glass, and it was to make stuff bigger so that he could better see all the potential clues. So if Sherlock Holmes was going to take on the Zodiac, he would get on a big computer so he could see everything well. He wouldn't be on a tiny phone. They've missed the detail. And if you're interested in the Zodiac case and learning about it, you've got 54 years of catch-up to do. And how fast can you catch up on a tiny screen?
Good point, Tom. We have mentioned a few times David Fincher's film called Zodiac. You were a consultant on that film. So before we move on to talking about the letters and the ciphers, I'm interested to know what you thought about the film in the end after having been a consultant and turning into Hollywood's go-to Zodiac guy.
Well, before Hollywood, I was Howard Stern's Zodiac guy. I was a guest on his show because on my website, I was working for him indirectly, and he found out I had a Zodiac website, so I got to be on Howard Stern's show in 1998. Not many people have talked about the Zodiac Killer with Howard Stern, so that's my claim to fame. And as far as the Fincher movie, it's a very long movie. It was, I think, 2-3 hours long. I really enjoyed the first 2/3, but, after that, I was just very uncomfortable sitting in the same spot for that long. I don't even remember the last third, but the first 2/3 were enjoyable. It's just not an accurate film. So if you think you've watched the Fincher movie and you think that you've seen something that's an accurate portrayal, it's pretty much not. Pretty much most of it is, in fact, make-believe.
It's hard for me to believe that people would think a Hollywood film, though, would be an accurate portrayal, that in itself, right?
I used to think things like that, and then I got on the internet. Today, for some reason, people think that if they see it in a YouTube presentation or if some guy talked about it in some podcast that they don't really remember anymore, that it was 100% accurate information. And nobody fact checks anymore.
Let's talk about the letters and the ciphers. I wanted to start, though, with how the Zodiac signed his letters with a cross-circle symbol. What are some theories of what that symbol represents?
Well, there was a watch that was called the Zodiac, and it had the watch company's symbol was on the watch face along with the word Zodiac, and the symbol was a cross-circle symbol. So it's really just like the name Zodiac for the killer named himself that, and before he named himself that, he was signing his letters with the symbol. So eventually it became both the name and the symbol. But I'm pretty sure that he probably got the name and the symbol from the Zodiac Watch Company, which was a quite popular watch back then. It was marketed towards males in their 30s. It wasn't a watch that was exclusive to skin divers. Back then, watches were kind of like today's cell phones, where every year it has a new gimmick to make you to want to buy it and get rid of your old one. So back then, watches, I think it was the late 60s when watches were first marketed to be able to be worn underwater. And so that was the marketing feature for the Zodiac watch. It was advertised in Playboy magazine. It was advertised in both of the major San Francisco newspapers in 1969. So anybody could have known about it. it would have been a popular gift, and it would have been something that just a white male adult in his 30s would have probably desired it because it was heavily marketed towards people in that demographic.
It sounds viable. It really does. Another thing that happened recently in 2020, 51 years after the crime spree, the Zodiac's 340 cipher was cracked. What can you tell us about that? And has any new information risen from this finding?
The 340 cipher, I didn't think it would ever be solved, and it was a big letdown because it was just kind of a boring message that didn't give any insight to Zodiac whatsoever. It was very bland. It was very complicated, however. The construction of it, compared to his first cipher, which was from July 31st, 1969, the first cipher was a basic substitution cipher. I compare it to A Christmas Story, the movie where Ralphie wants his BB gun and he gets his secret decoder ring from Little Orphan Annie, and he listens to the radio and they say, turn the ring to the number 3 position, and he does, and at the number 3 position you have the letter K, and then turn it to number 9, and you turn it to number 9 and it gives you a different letter of the alphabet, and then by the time you're done you have an actual message, and it was drink your Ovaltine or something like that. So that's a substitution cipher. It's simple, and if you had a decoder ring, a secret decoder ring, they used to come in cereal boxes in the 40s and 50s, then you knew how to do a substitution cipher. And that's what Zodiac's original cipher was. It was very rudimentary. That doesn't mean it's easy to crack, but it's easy to construct relatively. And then a few months later, he came out with the 340 cipher, and it turned out to be much more difficult. But yeah, that follow-up cipher, it didn't take a week to solve like the first one. It took 50-some years. And believe me,
while longer.
People were working on it too. Trust me.
It was considered unsolvable for ages, wasn't it?
Yeah, and people.
You considered
really
it unsolvable, did you?
I did. I didn't. I figured if it was going to get solved, it would have been solved already. The only valid solution the FBI ever saw happened just a couple of years ago. So people were working on it. People with high levels of understanding of cryptography spent a great deal of time. And so I'm just really curious how, if Zodiac's abilities were so advanced, why was his first cipher so rudimentary?
Look, in terms of the amount of murders that the Zodiac committed, there are 5 confirmed Zodiac murders. However, some people are of the belief that the murder of Cheri Jo Bates is linked to the Zodiac. What does the evidence tell us?
I'm glad you asked. Okay, so there's a lot of rewriting of history with Cheri Bates. She was determined back in November 1970, it was determined that Cheri Bates was absolutely a Zodiac victim. And people today have been trained to believe that Cheri Bates was only considered a Zodiac victim because of a newspaper reporter who is the one who got people thinking that she was a Zodiac victim, and that the Riverside police who were in charge of her murder never thought Zodiac was the perpetrator. And that's absolutely the opposite of reality. In fact, it was in early October 1969, just after the Lake Berryessa attack and just before the Paul Stein murder in San Francisco, both by Zodiac. It was right between those two murders that the Riverside police contacted Zodiac detectives and said, hey, we think that your Zodiac killer is responsible for the murder of a young woman down here in Riverside. So it's actually the Riverside police reaching out saying, we think Zodiac did it. And that's what happened in reality. And that was in late 1969. And today, history has been rewritten. And, Riverside never thought Cheri Bates was killed by the Zodiac. No, that's not true. And in fact, a year later, in November 1970, there was a task force meeting in Riverside involving the Riverside detectives as well as the Zodiac detectives. And they compared evidence, including handwriting, and determined that Cheri Bates was in fact killed by the Zodiac. And that's really important to consider. Now, since then, about 1985 or so, the mid-1980s, the Bates case was taken over by a detective named Bud Kelly, who's in prison for the rest of his life, by the way. And he was trying to make everybody who would listen to him believe that Cheri Bates was actually killed by a classmate. It turned out that Bud Kelly had a long-standing feud with the classmate, And since then, even though the classmate has been put under tremendous scrutiny, including DNA tests, etc., there's no evidence linking the classmate to the Cheri Bates murder. So, in my opinion, Bud Kelly was simply trying to mess with this individual. They've never had credible evidence that he was involved. But as far as the Bates being considered a Zodiac victim, that was the idea of the Riverside Police. And that documentation has been at ZodiacKiller.com since 1998. It's in the Cheri Bates section. And as far as I'm concerned, nothing has ever surfaced to indicate that Zodiac did not kill Cheri Bates.
It's interesting because a lot of the time that you spend searching for information in this case is you dispelling misinformation, right?
Yeah.
Getting the story straight again and again and again.
It's an uphill battle. Especially when I finally went to Reddit. I don't know if you've ever been there. I won't recommend it. But
I try to avoid it.
That's good. You're smart. Okay, well, I fell into that about at the end of 2017. I didn't even know. I'd heard about that website, but I didn't know they had a Zodiac section. And so I went there about 5 years ago for the first time, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Everybody had wrong information. And it was just remarkable to me how people would start discussions asking a basic question that they could have typed into Google and gotten better information, but they go to Reddit, they type in the question, and the people answering immediately have no idea what they're answering. They're giving out the worst information ever. And it was just this it was like a cesspool. I couldn't believe it. And I just felt like for some reason in this day and age, people either they just covet misinformation or they don't, they just can't recognize it. So it's pretty exhausting. I've spent the last 5 years playing catch up, trying to correct it all. In fact, at my discussion forum, I do have a dedicated discussion about.
And Tom, be honest with me. Are you still checking Reddit or have you stopped going into that hole?
I used to post there and then they banned me. And then, cause what I would do is I was posting and I was answering questions and giving links to the correct information, and the moderator didn't like that. I'd get downvoted, and so if you spell the victims' names incorrectly, you get upvoted. If you correct the spelling, it's come on, give him some respect, spell his name right. You get downvoted, If you link to source material, you get downvoted. But if you post nonsense, you get upvoted. So it's the most ass-backward place I've ever seen in my life. I do check it, though, because I got to stay up on top of everything that's going on. I check every day for misinformation. I can't correct it every day because there's so much. Sometimes I don't have time, but I do keep an eye on these places that I didn't even know existed 5 years ago.
Over the years, have you ever visited any of the crime scenes?
Oh, hundreds of times. I moved to San Francisco.
Hundreds of times.
Yeah. Some people get creeped out at places like that, but because of my childhood, I find it quite calming because I figure, something bad's already happened here, so I'm safe, The odds are I'm safe. Nothing bad's going to happen in this spot ever again. It's already happened. Lightning
doesn't strike twice in the same place.
Exactly. My first research trip for Zodiac was in 1998. And then I made many trips down there to all the scenes, Lake Berryessa, Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, Presidio Heights. I even went to Riverside in 2002. And then I moved to San Francisco for Zodiac research in 2004 and lived there for a year doing full-time Zodiac research. Couldn't afford it after a year because the package of top ramen is like $5. And the cheap vodka is really cheap. So after a year for my health, I've moved back to Portland.
Tell me more about the calming aspect of visiting the crime scenes.
I'd rather be 30 years old or 50 years old or 60 years old standing at Lake Herman Road than being 2 years old or 3 years old and seeing Charles Manson on the big TV right in front of me on the shag carpet. There's nothing worse than that. When they caught him and I saw his eyes on TV, I knew how to say mommy and daddy, but I didn't know how to say devil. And he was a devil. I think it was worse after they caught him, seeing what he looked like and seeing his followers and those crazy women and shaving their heads and all that stuff. And the idea that people like that were out there, either already in that mindset or able to be brainwashed. Ooh. Yeah, crime scenes are much better than that because the bad stuff already happened. But John Douglas is like, he and Robert Ressler and those guys, had a formula that they came up with and their own beliefs. And that is, if you're going to try to really research a crime, let alone solve it, you have to go to the crime scenes and you have to be where it happened and see the area and examine it. And so I knew I had to go. And then once I got there, I didn't mind it so much because I wasn't like, there are people that go to those areas because they're ghouls. And I've never been a ghoul. I've got some photos you would not believe that are Zodiac related in some way that I would never post at my site because I don't want to attract the people who would want to look at them.
A final question for you today, Tom. If the Zodiac case was solved tomorrow, which unsolved case would you dedicate your time fact-finding to?
D.B. Cooper.
Why?
Because I live right up by that area. When we moved to Oregon to get away from the craziness in California, we were not that far south of Mount St. Helens. And my dad and I used to go up there and for fishing. And then that place blew up. That volcano blew up. So that's when I knew I was cursed to have crazy stuff happen to me. Not many people have their favorite place in the world explode, but that's also the area where D.B. Cooper jumped out. And that's probably a solvable mystery, D.B. Cooper, because I think he probably died. So there are probably bones or something that you could find. That as far as serial killers, I'll probably be done actually investigating or researching unsolved murders, except for those that could be linked to the Zodiac, should he ever be identified. Has anyone ever retired from being an amateur detective?
I think you got to do it until there's resolution, right? That's the thing with cold cases. With other detectives, retired detectives that I've spoken to, they never retire from the case. They continue the work until either the case is solved or they themselves pass away.
Okay, so if the real detectives never actually retire, then I don't expect I will either. But to be honest, unfortunately, I don't see Zodiac getting solved anytime soon.
Thank you so much for your time tonight, Tom.